and particularly to Robert Lyman, who is speaking tonight on the Burma Campaign, the subject for his latest book, A War of Empires. Robert is a writer and historian who has published prolifically on the Second World War. A New Zealander by birth, he was educated in Australia before entering RMC Sandhurst and serving for 20 years in the British Army. He has a Master of War Studies from King's College, and his doctorate on Bill Slim was published as Slim Master of War. He was the BBC's historical advisor for the VJ commemorations in 2015 and 2020, and leads battlefield tours to Burma when not engaged in writing and lecturing. Works in the pipeline include an account of the two Chindit campaigns, Operations Longcloth and Thursday, and a combined biography of Britain's greatest generals of the Second World War, Bill Slim and Bernard Montgomery. He is a trustee and past chairman of the Kohima Educational Trust. The format of tonight's lecture is that Rob will talk for 55 minutes, followed by question and answer. Please key any questions you have at any point into the chat box, and I shall read them out to Rob after his talk. Rob, the rostrum is yours.
Valerie, thank you very much for that very kind introduction, and it is a real delight to be with you all this evening, albeit virtually, but I think we've all got used to this forum, and I hope you find it interesting. Well, the first challenge that I had when Valerie rang me up a few weeks ago and said, can you talk, is thinking, well, what do I talk about? The Burma Campaign is a very big subject, and what I don't want to do is simply trog through the campaign like a Japanese foot soldier in 1942-43 with my bayonet fixed and bore you all to tears. So I have taken a slightly unusual approach, I think, of asking myself, what is it that I can reflect about in terms of the Burma Campaign as it affected India and Japan and Britain and indeed the rest of the world in those years. Because I have been studying this for nigh on 35 years, and as Valerie's kindly said, I've written a few books in the past, and I've been out to Burma many times, and of course I go out to India most years as well. So this is an opportunity gratefully received of sitting back and saying, okay, what have I learned from my long years of study in the archives and of talking to people and of trying to understand more about this particularly important period of in our history, a period which is largely forgotten. It's not forgotten entirely. The claim that the Forgotten Army is a forgotten one is not true anymore, but it's certainly in terms of the way in which we view the Second World War and in terms of the way India views the Second World War, most importantly, it's not a subject that is really sitting in the spotlight. So what I'll do is I'll simply go through a little bit of introduction to the campaign, and then I'll talk about some of the impressions and the lessons I've learned. And when I sat down with my editor, wonderful Kate Moore, at the start of this process several years ago, Kate said, okay, what can you tell us that is new or different or interesting about the subject? And it was a useful challenge to me because we all inherit our history. We inherit it from school and our parents and what we read and so on. And my challenge through this process was to ask that question every time I came up with a subject I thought I knew very well. So what does this really mean what I think it means? Is there another way of looking at this subject? And I was really amazed, actually, in doing the research and writing the book, how much of the subject came to me from a new perspective and a new dimension. And I was very grateful for the opportunity to do so. Let me just start by talking about what was the longest campaign, the longest British campaign of the Second World War, which began on the 23rd of December 1941 when the Japanese Air Force bombed Rangoon until August the 15th, 1945, when there was a unilateral surrender by Japan. Of course, the war went on a little bit after that as remnants of the Imperial Japanese Army were rounded up in Burma and elsewhere. But we have essentially a period of just over 4 years where, in the first instance, the British Empire was badly defeated and the Japanese army was dominant and very successful in battle and in achieving its strategic aims. Japanese invaded Malaya, as you know, on the 7th/8th of December 1941 and captured Malaya, and Singapore fell in February 1942 at the same time that a land invasion was launched into Burma. Burma fell in May 1942 with the ejection of the very small Burma Army, the main part of which was Burma Corps, across the Chinwin into Manipur after a very successful Japanese campaign, a Japanese campaign of blitzkrieg, Asian blitzkrieg. The Japanese had studied the German operations in France assiduously and had planned very carefully for operations in Southeast Asia. Then in 1943, we had the first Chindit operation, known as Operation Longcloth, and the emergence of this very interesting character, Ord Wingate. And we also had an operation which in fact had begun at the end of the previous year, 1942, in Arakan, which was a dismal failure and saw a very strong, numerically strong British and Indian force ejected from Arakan. Arakan is that coastal strip now in Burma, lapping the Bay of Bengal. And 1944 was the turning point for the British and the Japanese in Southeast Asia. And it was a turning point in that it saw the first victories for the British and the Indian armies, and it saw the first defeats for the Japanese army. And in this year, we saw the very big Japanese invasion, very significant Japanese invasion of India, Operation Ugo, Operation C, into Manipur and Assam. We saw, prior to that, a few months before, the Battle of the Admin Box at Sinswaya in Arakan in February 1944. We saw the second Chindit operation, which we'll talk about tonight, Operation Thursday. And then in 1945, Allied victory in Assam and Manipur allowed for the follow-up across the Chinwin of the Japanese armies into Burma proper, and it saw the defeat of the Japanese in 45. So effectively, we've got a bit of a seesaw from defeat for the British in 1942 to quite remarkable victory for the Allies in 1945, victory for the Japanese in 1945, and quite remarkable defeat for the Japanese in 44 and 45. And part of my conversation with myself through writing this book has been to ask, why was it that the Japanese won so well at the start and failed so badly at the end, and vice versa? One of the immediate observations I'll make at the start of this conversation tonight is that one of the reasons why Britain and India had the opportunity to turn the tables on the Japanese was because the Japanese gave them time. They gave them effectively 1943. Very, very similar to the war in Europe as well. In Europe, there were 3 years between the initial Japanese invasion in France, or the start of the war, and El Alamein, and 4 years before Normandy. That gave, and the German invasion of Russia from June 1941 gave the Western Allies, Britain, of course, and America from December, time to build up their response to the Germans. Exactly the same thing happened in Burma. And it's an important point to note that it was really, in my view, the first strategic failure by Japan by not preventing the Allies from counterattacking, enabled the Allies to rebuild, rearm, and reconquer. Just so that we get our locations correct in our minds, I'll just show you this map. There are 1 or 2 other maps in the presentation, but this is a map showing the invasion routes, the Japanese invasion routes in 1942. And the places to note, of course, are Rangoon, which is down here, Toongu is important for the return journey in 1945. So just remember where Toongu is. It's sitting on the Setang River next to the Karen states known as the Karenni. Mektila is important for 1945, which is one of the locations of the very significant battles in 1945. We've got the famous Mandalay, which sits on the Irrawaddy Hare, which is important both in 42 and 45. I'm just going to nip up to the top right here to Myitkyina. Myitkyina is the capital of Kachin State and was the initial target of Stilwell's army from 1942 and from 42 onwards, coming down from Lido up here in the Brahmaputra Valley. So all this here that I'm showing you is Burma. Then we've got the border with India and the River Chindwin running down here, and places to note in India. Interestingly enough, this was from a book I published many years ago, and I looked tonight, and it doesn't even have Imphal in it. That little dot there is Imphal, the capital of Manipur. This is Kohima, which is a little hill station in the Naga Hills, running between Imphal and Dimapur, which is down here in the Brahmaputra Valley. The Brahmaputra Valley is really a critical location for all these operations, and Calcutta's here. So there we are. That's to give you a sense of the ground. First question we do need to ask ourselves, of course, is why Burma? And I spent quite a lot of time at the start of the book analyzing this question, and I really realized, I discovered, although I'd known this for all the years I've been researching it, I think I understood it with a greater profundity now, because China was the strategic linchpin for all of Allied operations in Burma right through to 1945. You can't understand the Burma campaign, and let me just stop by saying I call it the Burma campaign because it's nice and easy. It's the Far Eastern theatre of war. If you're a Brit or in the Commonwealth or in India, if you're an American, you will know it as the CBI theatre, China, Burma, India theatre. It's effectively all the same thing. So even though I call it the Burma campaign, hopefully you'll understand what I'm saying. China is very important because China was receiving American lend-lease largesse, ammunition, fuel, food, commercial supplies through what was known as the Burma Road from 1938 onwards. And this American largesse along the Burma Road, which began at the port of Rangoon, helped fuel the Cantonese army, the Kuomintang army of Chiang Kai-shek, hold down about half of the deployable Japanese army. It had about 20 divisions held down, which is quite an extraordinary feat. And I really have a new and more profound respect for the achievements of the Chinese in the 1930s in resisting Japanese aggrandizement as a result of my studies. So the Chinese were desperate to close this route of supply off and prevent the Americans from continuing to support Chiang Kai-shek. And I think there were two reasons for, actually, if you boil it down to the war in the Far East, one of them was Japanese anger and hostility towards what I'll just call the Western allies, you know who I mean, America and Britain primarily, for preventing Japan achieving its strategic goals in China. We don't have time to go through this too much tonight, but a lot of that was simply political rhetoric. And the Japanese got themselves very, very antagonized internally, domestically, about the efforts that America were taking to prevent Japan achieving its political destiny in China. It was very important, of course, for the United States to be able to support China. China had always held certainly for the last 2 decades, it had a very significant place in America's heart. It's a very interesting relationship between the two, which I deal with briefly in the book. For the United Kingdom, it's a slightly different story. And I have to say, I think for most of the war, Britain didn't really understand the Chinese perspective. Certainly didn't understand the Chinese perspective in 1940. And it became increasingly irritated with the demands of China without fully understanding where China was coming from. I have to say, I think that throughout the war, America had a much better and empathetic and intelligent view of the realities of war in China than did Britain. And it's very interesting that throughout this whole engagement, China formed the knot of or the heart of the relationship between America and Britain. Let me just explain that very briefly. China was desperate, once the Japanese had invaded Burma and closed the Burma Road, for Britain in particular, as the old colonial power, to re-invade Burma and to take it back. And the problem with Britain is that it didn't have the military wherewithal or the resources to do that. In fact, it didn't really have that wherewithal until 1945. And yet, until Britain did something to demonstrate that it was willing to retake Burma and therefore reopen the Burma Road, China wasn't going to cooperate with Britain. So you then had America as the go-between, trying to encourage Britain to actively get involved in recovering Burma, to support the Chinese. And there were lots of political machinations behind the scenes from all three countries, but it's not simply a question of China not pulling its weight, or America not pulling its weight, or Britain not pulling its weight. It's a little bit more complicated than that. When we get to Wingate, I'll draw the story to a close and explain why it was that actually Wingate for Churchill really was a man of destiny. This particular slide shows the Burma Road. The Burma Road ran all the way up to Kunming, which is just off the map here. Most of it actually ran so far as Lashio by rail, after which it was goods were transported by American trucks into the heart of Yunnan province. So I'll just pop through the timeline and talk about some of the things that have particularly struck me as I've been reanalyzing and reinvestigating the war in the Far East. The first was the rapidity of the defeat of the British in 1942 can be very easily and quickly explained. Britain had not defended and had no defenses worthy of the name for Burma. And troops were poured in early 1942, largely untrained Indian troops with very poor communications, very poor equipment, no training in formation operations. And they were very quickly defeated by the Japanese, who had a really good plan, a really effective plan to take Rangoon very quickly. And that plan, led by General Aida, had two divisions, the 55th Division and the 33rd Division. And effectively what happened was that the 55th Division, when it encountered Indian Burmese, that's the Burma Army or British positions, would attack them frontally, hold them, distract the British, while the 33rd Division bypassed everyone and made a race to the Satang Bridge in order to cross it and get to Rangoon very quickly. The campaign plan the Japanese launched was extremely proficient and effective. And by May 1945, the Japanese had not only taken Rangoon, but they'd pushed the British and the Indian Army entirely out of Burma, and the Chinese army entirely out of Burma altogether. One of the real sadnesses about the collapse of Burma, a complete surprise to the British, completely unprepared for this, was the impact on the Indian diaspora in Burma itself. And it's a significantly under-researched subject in my view. There's quite a lot of material on the subject, but just to give you an idea, about 50% of the population of Rangoon itself was of Indian origin. Britain had only been the colonial power since 1885, so roughly 50 years. And yet, as was the case, large numbers of Indians followed the Sirtar to wherever it went, wherever the British went, in order to be able to service the requirements of commerce and industry. And many of them were poor Tamils. And as soon as the Japanese bombing began, the first bombs fell on Rangoon on December 23rd, 1941, followed up by a savage bombing on Christmas Day, two days later. Large numbers of Indians fled the city, intent on heading north for safety, first to Prome and then the Irrawaddy or Mandalay. And then many of them just started walking back to India. And it's a real tragedy. No one really knows how many died. I think a reasonable estimate is 70,000 to 100,000 died. And they died because they were persona non grata in Burma. We don't have time to develop that tonight, but they were people apart. The Indians in Burma were a people apart, and they weren't appreciated in the culture in which they were operating, and they suffered miserably as a result. And it's something that is a subject that does need to be more widely known. Now, through 1942 and 1943, the British and the Indian armies were repeatedly defeated by the Japanese, and the British really struggled to understand how it was that the Japanese repeatedly bested them in battle. Now, it's important to note here that in many of the encounters in 1942, particularly 1942 through Burma, the Burma Corps, commanded by a young Major General Bill Slim, actually turned the tables on the Japanese on a number of occasions, particularly with his Gurkha troops. And when Bill Slim came out of Burma rather, in May 1942, and he had the opportunity to go to Ranchi and sit down and try to evaluate what had happened, he recognized that actually the Japanese had been beaten on a number of occasions. They were not unbeatable, they were not supermen, but they certainly had a ferocity and a commitment and a directness that surprised the British in particular. And there are lots of reasons for this that we don't have a huge amount of time to go into, but I will just say that the British in particular had long underestimated the Japanese soldier to their cost. And as a consequence, they hadn't trained themselves or the Indian Army to the extent necessary to fight the Japanese and to consider them as peer adversaries, i.e. a first-class adversary. The Japanese had adopted many of the lessons of 1918 in a way that the British Army, frankly, had forgotten. So infantry platoons were heavily populated by machine guns and by light mortars. So infantry platoons of 30 or 40 men were able to advance with large numbers of machine guns and the ability to project small bombs to 200 or 300 yards, a capability the British Army in the Far East did not have. So they were out-equipped, and the British also had forgotten many of the lessons from 1917 and 1918, and the defense lines in Malaya and in Burma were linear. They were lines of defenses that were, on the whole, very poorly manned and equipped, and the Japanese tactic was to infiltrate and go behind them. We don't have a huge amount of time to go into this, but in the offensive, the Japanese were very, very impressive. They were committed soldiers. They believed that the power of the samurai, which they held, was such that they and their gods would carry them through. Bushido was a very, very important concept to the Japanese soldier. It was probably more important to the officers, and it was military discipline which held the soldiers together. But they were a formidable foe in 1942 and 1943. When they got into the defense, they were immovable. They dug themselves down into quite remarkable defensive positions with trenches and bunkers that the British and the Indians had never seen before. And this particular really summarizes, this is a picture of Japanese troops in China, in fact, but look, there we are, we have the 4 machine guns in an infantry platoon. A British battalion had 16 machine guns. If they were lucky, a British platoon might have 2 of those, 2 Lewis guns. So the Japanese were much more formidably equipped. Its ethos of Bushido, its commitment to death, was very, very important. British and Indian soldiers, when they ran out of ammunition or felt that the situation wasn't going their way, would be quite reasonably happy to surrender until they realized over a very short period of time in 1942 that they weren't treated particularly well by their captors, who regarded them as cowards. But the Japanese would never surrender. Japanese soldiers fought to the death, Remember also, if I haven't said it already, that actually the Japanese were remarkably well trained for 1942. They'd spent the entirety of 1941 training for this particular operation. And I've mentioned that the Japanese structures were particularly good in terms of their firepower. So we then enter 1943. We don't have time, and it's actually a very depressing subject, talking about the failure of the operations in Arakan in 1943. But the first significant and perhaps strategic operation by the Allies as it was rebuilding itself, and I'll touch on that in a moment, was Operation Longcloth, which was the first Chindit operation. That particular picture isn't of Longcloth, it's from 1944, but I thought it gives a very good picture of some of the obstacles encountered by troops in 1943 and 1944 crossing rivers in Burma. Operation Longcloth was led by Brigadier then Ord Wingate, who was known to General Wavell, the Commander-in-Chief of India, who had badgered Wingate had badgered Wavell for the chance to participate in an operation behind Japanese lines. Originally, Operation Longcloth was to be coordinated with a conventional advance in Arakan and associated with an amphibious assault against Akyab, one of the ports in Arakan. But both the physical advance of the troops and the amphibious operation were cancelled, but Wavell allowed this particular operation to take place. Frankly, it was a dramatic failure. Very little was achieved. Of the 3,000 men who went on the operation, 1,000 didn't come back. So very significant casualties. But it was spun in terms of publicity by General Headquarters Delhi as a success, an opportunity for so-called British soldiers to operate freely behind Japanese lines and to cock a snook at the enemy. It's not entirely true or correct. But just going back to that point that I made earlier about the Chinese and the importance of we, Britain, persuading the Chinese and America that we were prepared to commit to the recovery of Burma, this was an opportunity that Churchill was craving. So Wingate's, the news of Wingate's expedition came at a time when Churchill was going off to the Quebec conference in October 1943, and he actually took Wingate with him in order to provide evidence to Roosevelt that, yes, we, the British, were prepared to enter and recover Burma. And not only that, we had the man of destiny, who was able to do it for us. So very important politically in 1943. 1943 also saw a dramatic rebuilding of the Indian Army, and I'm simply going to touch on this tonight. The photographs on the screen are from Indian soldiers fighting around Mektila in 1945, and give a really good picture of the change that took place between in the Indian Army between failure in 1942 and success in 1945. And I realize I haven't really explained this, so I'll do it now. There was no such thing as the British Indian Army. There was the Indian Army, which was the legally constituted army of India, and there was the British Army, and they operated together. And at formation level, that's brigade and divisional level, there were often in Indian divisions and Indian brigades, there were British regiments, but not always, and vice versa. So it's important to keep the distinction apart. And one of the things that really struck me in studying for this book again was this reality that the two armies operated entirely separately. They had their own manuals, they had their own training grounds, they had their own officers, they did things their own way. When the jungle training pamphlets were produced in 1943, the Indian Army did their own thing and the British Army did their own thing. They are two very separate things, but they worked fabulously together. And I think that's one of the dramatic successes in 44 and 45. The numbers. So the Indian Army in 1939 consisted of about 190,000 men, of which one division, the 4th Indian Division, had been established in 1938 for deployable operations abroad. We're talking about 15,000 men. A division is about 15,000 men. And it's very interesting that that 4th Indian Division, which fought brilliantly throughout the Second World War, was the part of the Indian Army that was designed to reinforce the British Army wherever it operated. So it was built on British lines, but it was very much an Indian division, and a subsequent division followed. But very quickly, the rest of the army was largely, and I don't say this pejoratively, but it was designed for gendarmerie type operations or light infantry operations, not least for on the northwest frontier, and for military support to the civil power in India. That all changed, of course, with the Japanese invasion of Southeast Asia, with the Japanese now knocking on the gates. There was a requirement for the Indian Army to become a thoroughly modern, conventional army, able to deliver firepower and military capability right across the spectrum of operations. And by 1945, we have this. We have an Indian Armored Corps, the 4th Armored Corps, leading the vanguard of the 14th Army through Burma, that if you lifted lock, stock, and smoking barrel and placed it in Normandy, for instance, would have done, in my view, a very, very good job indeed. We had mobile, we had tanks, we had mobile armored infantry, we had integrated mobile artillery, we had direct communications with cab ranks, that's what they're called, cab ranks of aircraft in the air, flying above 24/7, flying above the operations on the ground, and fully integrated with the troops operating on the ground in quite a remarkable way. Just think about the difference between the Indian Army formations that found themselves confronting the Japanese in 1942 with this quite dramatic change in 1945. So here you need to just appreciate we have a sea change in capability in the Indian Army, which is quite remarkable. Then in 1944, we get to the great turning point at Imphal and Kohima. Remember, if you don't know, in Kohima, this is on the right-hand side, a screenshot from a drone, which was taken earlier this year, in fact, of the cemetery at Kohima. This is the Kohima Ridge. And it was this ridge that stopped the Japanese invasion of India. This is the fighting between the 4th and the 20th of April 1944 that prevented General Sato's 31st Division from actually getting into the Brahmaputra Valley, which I showed you a little bit earlier. And on the left-hand side, there's a picture of a painting which was done for me by a fantastic artist called Peter Dennis many years ago of the tennis court. So this was a turning point in the war. Just before Kohima was the battle in Arakan, which I've mentioned, at a place called Sinswaya, where the box was first used. And the box was a new British tactic which had been constructed by General Slim and Christensen and a few others, which was designed to ensure that when the Japanese infiltrated through British positions, the old idea of the line, the defensive line, was done away with. British and Indian soldiers would defend themselves in a box, repel any attempts by the Japanese to attack or penetrate them, and then carry out aggressive counterattacks, particularly at night, using patrols and ambushes to attack the Japanese and make the Japanese feel vulnerable. So it was turning tables on the Japanese. That particular tactic worked particularly well. And just to explain the really quite complicated operations around Imphal and Kohima, let me just say that about 100,000 Japanese came rushing across the border into Manipur, which is here, capital of which is Imphal, and Assam, what is now Nagaland, the Naga Hills and Kohima, with the ambition perhaps of getting down to Dimapur. And I've always described this as the spokes on a wheel. It certainly helps me, but I hope it helps you. But effectively, the Japanese general responsible for Operation Ugo decided that he wouldn't concentrate his forces in 1, 2, or 3 main thrusts into Manipur. He would divide his troops into 6. One would come up through Bishanpur under General Yanagida. Another would cross the Mombi track under general associated with General Yamachi, General Yamato. Another, the main attack, would come up under Yamachi across the Shenam saddle here. Another would come up on the 15th Division and fall on the top of fall on Imphal from the north and the final under General Sato would climb over the hills to Kohima. Now, we don't have time to stop, but if you keep that in mind when you get the book and you read through it, just think about this being the spokes on a wheel. And this was actually quite a smart idea of Motiguchi, if only he could get into Imphal quickly. But there's a real problem with Motiguchi, and that is his arrogance. He really didn't think that he'd be facing much of a threat from the Allies. He gave his troops 21 days to get into Imphal and Kohima and to defeat the British and the Indians he found there. And he gave them enough ammunition and food to do so. Unfortunately, things unraveled very, very quickly, and he wasn't able to achieve what he wanted to do. The British under General Slim withdrew their forces into the Imphal plain and fought the Japanese all the way back, such that the Japanese were unable to get into Imphal and achieve their goal. And a long grinding fight took place in the months that followed, all the way through to August, by which time Motiguchi's legions had been smashed. It didn't help Motiguchi to have very poor relationships with his three divisional commanders, General Yamauchi, Yanagida, and Sato. They all hated each other. They didn't hate each other. They hated Motiguchi, and Motiguchi hated them. And let me suggest to you tonight that it's not the ideal situation to have an army commander with such an antagonistic relationship with his divisional commanders. 1944 also saw Operation Thursday, which was the Lord Wingate's second expedition into Burma. Now, was Thursday everything that it cracked up to be? I often ask people whether what they know about the Burma campaign, and the majority of people will say, well, it was about Lord Wingate, wasn't it? And it was about the Chindits. And I just need to say right at the outset that in no way in my analysis am I decrying what the Chindits achieved. What the Chindits did. I mean, they absolutely went through hell in order to be able to try to demonstrate Wingate's plan. But I think in all of these things, we do need to ask ourselves the question as to whether it achieved the strategic objective that Wingate had set for it. My answer in a nutshell is no, it didn't. And I'll try and explain briefly why. I think it's important that we do consider this tonight. The first thing is that Operation Thursday from February to June 1944 was designed to occupy a piece of ground which I've just described as the railway corridor between Indore and Myitkyina, denoted in the square box to the right-hand side. You can see Imphal in the circle to the left. It involved 23,000 men and about 300 mainly American aircraft. And the whole rationale of Operation Thursday was to provide direct support to General Stilwell, who was coming down from the north, an arrow from the north, from Lido, through the jungle, through Kachin territory to capture Myitkyina, which he eventually did in August. So that was the purpose of Operation Thursday. The real challenge was that this began at about the same time that Motiguchi began his own assault against Imphal and Kohima. And we have a situation actually where the Japanese primary effort is against Imphal. Very little effort is concentrated in the east around the railway corridor. And this concept of being able to destroy the Japanese lines of communication up to Myitkyina failed completely. They didn't use that line of communication at all. The division up in the north, the 18th Japanese Division, effectively lived off its own resources and used the Irrawaddy. So there was a real challenge here. And let me just move on because I don't want to run out of time. I would argue that Thursday was arguably in the wrong place. If we go back and have a look at this picture, imagine if I moved that red box so that it was placed over the Chindwin and over the crossing places the Japanese were using to move into Manipur and Assam. Think about the difference that might have had for the Allies. it was also very dependent on air power and air cover from a long way away in Assam. And there are lots of lessons learned through the Thursday operation. And this is one of them. But the other interesting thing to bear in mind is that, Orde Wingate, without much practical experience, had come up with this idea that his long-range penetration idea could actually win the war for the Allies, and that conventional forces were never going to be able to defeat the Japanese. And unfortunately, he made that prediction just a month or two before conventional forces, Indian Army forces and British Army forces under General Slim, were doing precisely that at Imphal and Kohima. So Wingate was actually proved wrong. And I think we just need to ask the question, what did Thursday deliver strategically? Did it advance the aim that Churchill and Roosevelt had desired of it? And the answer is no. But in war, lots of mistakes are made, and I'm afraid that this was one of them. Wingate was right, however, in arguing for long-range penetration operations, and there were three that were very, very significant. And I like showing this photograph in the main because this is Brigadier General Lancelot Perrone of the Royal Artillery. In particular, I like showing it because of his wonderful moustache. But Brigadier Lancelot Perrone led one of the Chinda Brigades, 23 long-range penetration brigade, in the northern Naga Hills in 1944 in support of the British operations around Kohima and Imphal, and undertook a classic long-range penetration brigade to deny the hills to the Japanese. They're very, very successful. There were two other very significant operations by special forces in Burma. One was Operation Character in 1945, and the other was in the Culloden Valley by the 81st West African Division in 1944 and 45, which we've all forgotten as well, but it's worth reminding everyone tonight. And I'm just going to leap ahead to these now and just touch on them. I'm going to go back to the major battles in a moment, but Operation Character was the operation by Special Operations Executive to prevent the Japanese from reinforcing the strategic town of Toungoo, the town I showed you on the map right at the start on the Setang Valley. Effectively, and leaping ahead in time, Slim was desperate to get his armored corps, the 4th Armored Corps, down to Rangoon before the rains began in May 1945. And in order to be able to do that, he needed to get to Toungoo first and prevent the Japanese from occupying it. And he did this. Slim particularly and deliberately used the Special Operations Executive to raise 14,000 guerrillas, Karen guerrillas from the hills to fight the Japanese and prevent the Japanese from occupying Toungoo. And it was a dramatic success. The Karen guerrillas killed more Japanese than the conventional Indian and British forces in 1945, and arguably enabled Slim to get to Rangoon before the rains fell and force the capture of Toungoo, forced the Japanese commander in Rangoon to evacuate, thus allowing the amphibious assault Operation Dracula to take place. So if you ask me the question about the effectiveness of special force operations, long-range penetration operations, in Burma, Operation Character was dramatically successful and a very, very important component of the operation. The other was the Culloden Valley, which is here. Culloden Valley, actually, this is a picture of actually East African soldiers near the Chinwa, not an Arakan, but I put it in because it's a great photograph. But going back to the map, here we have Arakan here, and this blue line here is the Culloden Valley. The Culloden Valley is a roadless valley running effectively north-south along the coastline. And from 1944 through 1945, the British sent the 81st West African Division down this valley. For 9 months, the 81st West African Division was on aerial resupply. And their progressive advance down this valley forced the Japanese to withdraw from Akyab and withdraw the troops south and across into Burma proper. And it meant that Akyab, the amphibious attack on Akyab, was also undertaken unmolested. as a consequence of this quite extraordinary operation by the West Africans. And it's a story that we need to be reminded of. We must never forget also the troops of the Northern Combat Area Command. This is the American force under General Stilwell, first of all, that was moving from the northern Brahmaputra Valley, from Lido, all the way through the mountains, down to Myitkyina, down here, with a Chinese, a British and American trained Chinese army, which eventually forced the Japanese 18th Division out of Myitkyina by August 1944, a subject that we in Britain don't know a huge amount about. And of course, everyone in America thinks that it was the NCAC that won the war in Burma, but we'll forgive them for that because the American contribution to the Far East was really quite remarkable. We'll then come to the great operations in Burma in 1945 around Mandalay and Mektila. And those of you who might have read anything about Bill Slim, General Bill Slim, will recognize that it was these battles that really set the seal on his particular genius. And they're quite remarkable, and I'll try and show it in a couple of slides. So why were the battles of Mandalay and Mektila so important? Well, soldiers ask themselves the question, what's the best way of overcoming an enemy position or an enemy army? We can either go head on and confront the enemy mass and degrade the enemy mass with tanks and armor and aircraft and infantry and make them less able to fight us, or we can force them not to fight by enveloping them or bypassing them and attacking something to their rear that's equally valuable to them. So the question is, do we go head on or do we maneuver around? And maneuver doesn't just mean mobility, it means trying to outthink the enemy. And to give you some examples of successful maneuver, the classic example was the Japanese invasion of Burma in 1942, when General Aida fixed the British with the 55th Division and then used his 33rd Division to quickly move his troops through the jungle towards the Stang Bridge. And it put such pressure on the British that they weren't able to react in terms of their decision-making as a consequence. General Irwin, who commanded the British troops in Arakan in 1943, I'm afraid, failed to understand this concept and launched repeated head-on attacks on very, very well dug-in, defended Japanese positions and failed at every single one of them. In fact, 11 attacks in a row failed to get through at a place called Don Bike. But interestingly enough, the Japanese in 1944 didn't copy this very successful modus vivendi in Manipur and Assam, and they also attacked head-on and had forgotten the virtues of campaigning, where you seek an operational objective and you allow defenders to sit where they are and to let them wither on the vine or to be mopped up by troops coming from behind. In 1945, Slim perfected this approach to war fighting at Mandalay and Mektila. And he did it by, there's a little bit of luck involved here. His original plan was to cross the Chindwin at Kaliwa up here and to move his two corps. He had 33 Corps and 4 Corps down to Mandalay and to envelop Mandalay. And this is where the majority of the Japanese forces, where the Japanese Burma Area Army were based in this area here. Slim's assessment was that actually General Kimura, who now commanded this army, would have the bulk of his army in the northern side of the Irrawaddy, where my cursor is, around the Shwebo Plain. But when the 19th Dagger Division started beginning its move under General Pete Reese across the Chindwin, he came across very limited opposition, and Slim very quickly, within a couple of weeks, realized that actually General Kimura had withdrawn his troops to the southern and eastern sides of the Irrawaddy, where he wanted to fight the British during and after they'd crossed the Irrawaddy. He knew that the British would be after them in Mandalay because it was the seat of Japanese authority and the heart of the Japanese military machine. Slim had a very different idea. Slim looked south. He wanted to find a place where he could defeat the Japanese without confronting their mass head on. And he looked to Mektila. Mektila is the town south of Mandalay, 60 miles south of Mandalay, which is the nodal point for all Japanese communications to the north by road and by rail. And Slim thought, if I can slip a corps into Mektila secretly, capture Mektila, I've then taken the legs from Kimura's stall. He won't have anywhere to go. The only place he can go is to escape east into Thailand. And that, to cut a long story short, is exactly what happened. Slim pretended to the Japanese that his entire army was crossing the Chindwin and moving on Mandalay from the north. Dummy corps radio setups were established, and the Japanese were completely persuaded that the whole of the 14th Army was coming onto Mandalay from the north, whereas secretly a road was being built for 300 miles from Tamu down the Gangor or the Maitha Valley here, crossing across to Pakiku here. In fact, the map's slightly out, Pakiku is about here, and then crossing with a deep thrust by an armored corps at Mektila. And the Japanese were completely discombobulated by this thrust and its severity. Kimura turned his troops around to try and defeat the British and the Indian Army at Mektila, but failed to do so. And as a consequence of that, Kimura's defense of the Irrawaddy shore was undone. And that's the story of Operation Extended Capital. That's, in a nutshell, the story of the really decisive battle in Burma in 1945. And I'm coming towards the end of the presentation now, but I wanted just to go back. These are the main points of the campaign. I want to go back to a number of the themes. And I've really given the game away here because one of the things that repeatedly struck me in writing this book were the numbers. And it's very salutary for us as Brits particularly, or as individuals in the Commonwealth, to understand that of the 1.3 members in Southeast Asian Command, this is the command led by Admiral Lord Mountbatten from late 1943 onwards, of the 1.3 million soldiers in SEAC, 58% were Indian, just over 20% were American, a much smaller percent were British, African, and Chinese. Now, for Brits brought up on the story of the Burma Star Association and of valiant Brits fighting through the nasty jungles of Burma and decrying the idea that the Americans had anything to do with the war in Burma, or indeed anything to do with its success, this particular chart is disconcerting, to say the least. Isn't it interesting that the British had about 100,000 troops in Burma and the Americans nearly 3 times as many? Now, admittedly, many of the Americans were involved in the Hump airlift, a subject I haven't spoken about tonight because of time, but quite a significant number of Americans were, of course, fighting in Northern Combat Area Command. So one of the things that emerged from my study is this rebalancing of my ideas about who actually fought the Burma campaign and why. And if you drill down into the numbers even more, it's even more interesting, because of the 606,000 fighting troops, known as operational troops in the statistics, and this is essentially those in 14th Army and 15 Corps, 606,000 troops, 87% were Indian, exactly 10% were British, and 3% were African. Now, isn't that fascinating? This does demonstrate, actually, that the primary fighting capability, the primary numbers, the primary effort was an Indian effort. And it reminds us that, as I've explained, Burma saw the transformation of the Indian Army, and Burma was to a large extent an Indian victory. And we don't have time to go into that. We might touch on this in questions. Very, very interesting questions that come out of this are, of course, why did so many Indians volunteer to join the army against the Japanese? Yes, we will touch on that, I'm sure, in questions. And why did they manage to fight so well? And it's quite extraordinary. And in my final chapter in my book, I asked some of these questions, and many of those questions, can't really be answered definitively. I've interviewed about 87 Indian veterans who have all given me the same answer, but it's interesting nevertheless. One of the challenges we have as historians, of course, is that modern India, rightly or wrongly, sees history to have begun in 1947, and the conversations that I would hope that would have taken place in India haven't yet. Increasingly so, there are a number of Indian academics, and there's a lot more interest in India about the war in the Far East, and those questions are now starting to be undertaken. So a couple of themes that sort of strike me from the campaign, additional themes that strike me from the campaign from a military perspective, which I'll just run through very quickly. This was that Slim himself was really one of the linchpins of victory. Slim was the man who had undertaken a full evaluation of the defeat in 1942. He had the opportunity to rebuild the army in conjunction with General Claude Auchinleck, who was now the commander-in-chief of the Indian Army from June 1943. And he was in a position to put in place a whole series of training and instructions and so on that enabled the Indian Army to be retrained into a fighting organization that could take on the Japanese. And the core of Slim's mode of warfighting is exemplified by the great success at Mandalay and Maktila in 1945. And I mean, this particular quotation from him is really apposite in my view, and I'll read it out. He says, war is achieved, first of all, success in war is achieved by focusing on attacking where the enemy is weak in terms of his combat power, rather than where he's strong. Avoid direct confrontation with the enemy mass, that's the mass of his army, by the use of all weapons, ballistic or otherwise, including psychological weapons, without engaging in attritional slogging matches. Think of the First World War. Let the enemy wear himself out in fruitless battles or make him believe that defeat is inevitable. Outthink him and thereby defeat him. And I think that summarizes it perfectly. In terms of the restructuring of the army, a number of tactical themes emerged. The army needed to adapt or adopt new approaches for defense, such as the box. They needed to adopt new approaches for the attack, which was about enveloping the enemy and infiltrating rather than going head on. The army learned a lot from the Japanese about being relentless in their pursuit of victory and being brutal. There's a concept of every man being a combatant. The old idea of the Indian Army having followers who were non-combatants was thrown out. The 14th Army had no followers. And the army had to recognize that in everything it did, it needed to fight harder than the Japanese. There were a number of operational principles which were effectively around designing an army that could defeat a particular enemy. And I think that was one of the big challenges leading up to the Second World War, identifying who the enemy was likely to be, and then calculating the best way of constructing an army to defeat them. We never did that with the Japanese. One of the reasons for failure in 1942 was that Britain in particular had dismissed the idea that the Japanese army would be a formidable foe and had put no intellectual effort in whatsoever to thinking about how to defeat the Japanese. Some of these principles repeat some of the points I've made earlier. The importance of administration and supply in India was absolutely critical given the length of the lines of communication. Air power and land forces needed to be integrated fully, and they were to an extent not seen actually in Europe in 1945. Air transport needed to be very significant. When 4 Corps, the 4th Armored Corps, was advancing towards Rangoon, throughout all of 1945, 90% of all its combat supplies, so petrol, oil and lubricants, ammunition and fuel, were carried by air. It's really, really quite extraordinary. And we have forgotten the enormity of the air effort in the Far East. I'll just give you one little example. We haven't talked about the hump because I haven't had time, and I'm about to wrap up now. the hump airlift lifted about 650,000 tons of supplies to China from late 1942 through to late 1944. So we're talking about 2 years, 650,000 tons. I just think that the carrying capacity of a C-47 is 2.5 tons. That's about 200, well over 200,000 C-47 flights, which for 2 years is about 240 to 250 flights every single day. It was the largest logistical effort ever undertaken in human history, and it was only outdone by the Berlin airlift. And incidentally, as my friend Giles Milton has reminded me recently, the men and women who were responsible for the Berlin airlift all those years later had cut their teeth in Burma. My final point is really, well, there are a series of reflections that I've touched on. The role of China, 1941 being a lash out at the end of 10 years of fighting by Japan. And I'll just move on and make my final point because I know I'm running out of time. The one thing we all forget is the impact of this war on Burma. And although I didn't have time in my book, in fact, there are a couple of chapters that I weren't able to put in because of, it was 200,000 words, how long can books be? It's very important that we do spend time thinking about the impact of the war on Burma itself and on its polity, because in a very real sense, I believe that the divisions we see, political divisions we see in Burma today are a direct result of 1942. Now, that's another lecture. I'll have to do that some other time, but I've run out of time and I'll hand back now to Valerie. And thank you very much for your kind attention.
Rob, thank you so much for that absolutely superb talk. And I can testify, having read every one of the pages and a number of the notes and the bibliography too, because I was interested in your sources, that you write as well as you speak. It's an exceptionally well-written book. It's very fast-paced. I found it very difficult to put down. Maps are terrific, as you'd expect from your PowerPoint. Fantastic book. I'm sure it's selling loads. It was a very special lecture for me because as a descendant of the British and India, the Burma Campaign is of personal interest because family members served in it, retreating with the Indian Army in 1941 in defeat and airlifted back in with the Chindits. My father's generation and cousins were Chindits. So really fantastic. And let me remind you, although I'm sure you need no reminding, that of that very large Indian army, it was officered by British in the main, and also many of these were like slim career soldiers with the Indian Army who'd been in India for decades and, like Slim, spoke 3 or more languages. They were very close to their men, and others were like Colonel John Masters, that fabulous writer whom you mentioned a few times in your book, from generations who served generation after generation in India, and their descendants are represented in our audience tonight. So let us not forget the officers of the Indian Army in this last great war that they participated in, because of course India achieved its independence not long after. Now we've got quite a few questions, so let's scroll back through them. Now here's the first one. Sir Reginald Dorman Smith, this is about the defeat phase.
Yeah.
Sir Reginald Dorman Smith clearly got things wrong in not calling for an evacuation earlier. Was this stubbornness or incompetence? Were there personal ramifications?
I don't think it was incompetence. I do feel very strongly for Reginald Dorman Smith, and he's been given a very bad press. And quite rightly, people were very angry with the lackadaisical approach to the evacuation, but it's easy to do that in hindsight. No one expected the Japanese, first of all, and until early 1942, the Japanese to even invade Burma. I'm not excusing this. I think the failure to appreciate what might happen in Burma is inexcusable, but that's not Dorman Smith's fault. That was a complex set of arrangements for which the blame sat in London. The British plan was actually, the British expectation was the Japanese would bomb Rangoon in order to prevent its use as a port. But there was no expectation, absolutely zero expectation, the Japanese would invade, until indeed they did in February 1942. And even when the Japanese did invade, the 15th Army came across the border from Thailand. Wavell thought that the Japanese could be held, certainly held far forward into Nestram. And none of that happened, of course. And I think, it's very easy in hindsight to say we in Burma should have had an evacuation policy. Now, we didn't. There are lots of reasons for that. What do you say to your Indian, the people effectively running Burma for you? All the civic and utility, civic structures and the utilities are run by Indians. Do you have an evacuation policy for everyone? You're talking about 1 million people, or do you just have one for yourselves? In fact, there was a reprehensible evacuation policy that was ad hoc, and it was effectively whites only, and on some of the ships to leave Rangoon, and there are some terrible stories associated with that, and we don't have time to go into that tonight. But I have to say, Reginald Dorman Smith was an honourable man who recognised when Burma was falling that we had not done enough to keep the Burmese on side, to offer them a stake in their own future, and the administration of Burma had been slack and weak, and as a consequence, large numbers of people suffered terribly as a result.
I've got another question along those lines, which is, are you not being hard on the British for being rolled up in Burma? Was this not the case with the Dutch, French, American, and Thais too? Are the British not more culpable for the loss of Singapore, or was that inevitable too, given the extraordinary dynamism of militarist Japan?
Well, great question. And I don't think I'm being hard on them. I mean, the real challenge, I'm actually at the moment writing another book with General Sir Richard Dannett on the story of the British Army between 1918 and 1942. And we've written the chapters on Singapore and Burma. And the reality is that no one in the British administrations took the threat of the Japanese seriously. Now, they didn't do that in America or in the Dutch East Indies either. And indeed, the French didn't put up a struggle in Indochina because they couldn't, because the Germans basically gave Indochina to Japan following the collapse of France in 1940. But it really seems extraordinary looking back how little effort had been made to defend Malaya, Singapore, and Burma. And in a nutshell, there were very good plans to defend Malaya, and those plans were not, however, put into effect. Interestingly enough, those plans were written in 1936, and they were prepared by a certain Lieutenant Colonel Percival. Now, he also happened to be the Lieutenant General responsible in 1942, but there were the causes of failure in Malaya and Singapore can basically be reduced to incompetent planning for war. And I'm afraid the same is the case for Burma. The first duty of any government is to protect its citizens, and yet no one had done any real planning around the defense of Burma itself. So I'm not being unduly hard on the British. The Americans had failed badly to prepare for war in the Philippines, and the Dutch were frankly a disaster. But there were lots of political issues associated with the Dutch, not least of all the fact that the home country was under German rule. And and I know a little bit about this, but the Dutch were politically at 6s and 7s in Java and Sumatra. So, but a huge amount more could have been done to protect Malaya, and by extension Singapore and Burma, from the Japanese. Really quite significant. If decisions have been made in the 1930s to defend both colonies effectively, I think there's a very good chance the Japanese couldn't have achieved anything that they did achieve. They achieved success because they had very inept opposition.
Our next question is, thank you, Robert, for your interesting presentation. My question concerns China. You referred to the importance of the Burma Road and US supplies to China and briefly referred to China's army. But according to Rana Mitter's China War with Japan, China provided the main force in Burma in 1942. It comprised some of China's best troops who performed well, better than the British. But Chiang was facing massive Japanese armies in China itself, and keeping his army in Burma was seriously weakening his efforts in his own country. Although the Japanese appeared to defeat the Chinese, their retreat was as much due to redeployment to China, where China was holding down massive forces, an enormously important task. That the British never took the Chinese seriously was a real British failure, which reduced China's willingness to intervene later with the Americans. Any comments?
I completely agree with every single word, Rana, you've just said, and I completely agree with Rana's book, which is magisterial, and I like him a lot, and I think he's absolutely right. And the way in which we, the British, treated the Chinese politically in 1940-41 was reprehensible. We didn't understand the Chinese and didn't really make much effort to do so. And I'm afraid I have to point the finger of blame at Wavell for this. He had the opportunity of involving the Chinese in a much more positive way in the defense of Burma than was actually the case. And I have to say, I don't think Wavell covered himself in glory in 1942. But, you know, Rana is absolutely right about the Chinese, and I make those points in my book. And I even talked to an incident around Yan'an where the Chinese army rescued the British and enabled the British retreat to continue. In 2015, I was invited by the government of Taiwan to go to Taipei and be involved in a symposium on the Chinese war in 1942. And I loved it. It was absolutely fabulous. I mean, to be able to discuss the Chinese, the role of the Chinese army for the first time with Chinese scholars who had access to all the original material. And this is one of the problems in Britain, that we still don't have access to much Chinese original primary sources. Rana Mitter, of course, reads and speaks Chinese perfectly, and Mandarin in particular, and has produced an excellent book. And it's just a reminder that this is another dimension of the war in Burma that we in the West don't fully understand.
Now, I think the next question refers to the percentages you were talking about at the end of your talk. It says it's percentage of population, ? Were British contingents stiffeners for Indian troops?
No, that's a little bit of a myth, and I know exactly where that came from. They weren't stiffeners at all. In fact, what tended to happen was that there were two British divisions in the Far East, the 36th British Division and the 2nd British Division, which was fought at Dunkirk and was sent out to India in 1942, and a number of other independent regiments and brigades which formed part of formal Indian divisions. There were a number of Indian divisions that had no British troops at all, but they were not stiffeners in any sense of the word. In fact, I would argue that by 1945 by 1944 and 45, to be honest, I think the Indians fought better than the British. I think that, and it's very interesting when you come to look at the decisions made by General Slim as to who was going to cross the Irrawaddy and who was going to go beyond Mektila. The two British divisions were stood down. 36 and 2 Division was stood down, and the Indian divisions carried on. Now, arguably, I don't know the reasons for it. I mean, I have supposed that it's primarily because the lift required for aircraft of an Indian division was much less than a British division. But, you know, the British troops were a long way from home. They weren't particularly fighting as well as they could have done. We know that the British 2nd Division was regarded by the Indian Army as not having fought as well as it could have done at Kohima. And for that reason, General Blackjack Grover, John Grover, was removed from his command by General Montague Stopford, the commander of 33 Indian Corps. And okay, if you can recognize that there's always been a bit of competition between the British and Indian armies, and you take that out of the account, I think it's true that the Indian divisions fought on the whole better than the British ones in 1945.
Very happy to hear how well the Indian Army, officered by the
yes.
British and Indian, fought, considering the discrimination, let's say,
yes.
or
yes.
contempt a lot of highfalutin British officers had for their Indian Army
Too true.
counterparts. Actually, we've got another little paragraph on the end of the stiffeners query, which was any parallels between Wellington in the peninsula and Slade. We couldn't afford to lose numbers.
Yes, what a very good point. Yes, lots of parallels between Wellington. I mean, I think that the real thing about Slim, which I need to be reminded of regularly, is that Slim had the ability, had a direct line to Mountbatten, had a very good relationship with Mountbatten, but he could basically do what he wanted. But he couldn't afford to lose numbers. All the way through this campaign, the Japanese had more troops. And it's very interesting that at the point at which the 14th Army crossed the Chindwin in December 1944 into Burma, General Kimura, whose army, the 15th Army, had been defeated at Imphal and Kohima, still had more troops available to him than we did. So Slim was forced to think not intuitively, but imaginatively about how he could deploy his forces, which preserved what was otherwise a wasting asset. Now, that's no surprise, actually. In the work that I've done in part to compare Monty and Slim, they're both products of the First World War. And one of the driving realities of 1918 for the British Army was the importance of using firepower rather than manpower. Use firepower to defeat the enemy and to win your objectives, not use effectively an important but wasting asset, which is your manpower. Bear in mind that by 1945, there were many British soldiers and officers who had been in the Far East for 6 years. Most of them had been in the Far East for 4 years, but 6 years, it's a long time. And, they didn't necessarily want to be there. You wanted to be able to fight the enemy intelligently using maneuver and firepower, not manpower. But a great question. Yes, I agree with you. The parallels between Slim and Wellington are well made.
Next question is, I'm not an expert in the Burma campaign, but I'm curious to know if American and/or British naval forces played any role.
Oh, yes, massively. Not so much around, well, in 1942, the Japanese really dominated the Bay of Bengal and made a bit of an attempt at Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, which failed. But there were a significant series of battles in 1942, which my friend Anthony Boyd has written about in his book. But by 1944, and the shift to the Pacific, the British Sixth Fleet joined the Americans and played a significant role in naval operations against the Japanese. So the answer is yes, very, very significant after a bit of a stumbling start.
The next question is, please could you kindly repeat the percentage of Indian soldiers in the Burma campaign?
Okay.
58% or 87%? Many thanks.
Well, I would use the final figures for the combat troops, 606,000 men. 87% of those 606,000 men were Indian, 87%. 10% were British and 3% were African.
Next question. How did the Japanese sustain their army in the field? How did they get supplies from Japan to their forces operating in Burma?
Okay, well, it's a very, very interesting question. And the truth is, by 1945, very little was coming from Japan. That which was coming from Japan tended to be very, very small amounts, because the Pacific had by then become an American lake. And there was very, very little active Japanese transport available. Most Japanese transports, actually, I think there's the vast majority, the vast percentage, were sunk during the war. And the tragedy is many of them returning to Japan had Allied prisoners of war in them who died as a consequence of submarine attacks. The answer to the story, to the question, is that the Japanese behaved like locusts. They lived off the land, they lived off what Burma could provide. And Burma is a very, very rich country. By 1941, Burma was the third largest rice producer in the world and produced an enormous amount of India's rice requirements. And one of the reasons for the terrible famine in Bengal in 1943 was, of course, the collapse of Burma in 1942. And the Japanese lived off what they could take from the Burmese, which is tangentially one of the reasons why Burma ultimately rejected the Japanese. The Japanese occupation of Burma was not a success, and we haven't had time to talk about it, but the gentleman you can see in the photograph here, Aung San, who I have an enormous respect for, actually took his Burma National Army out of the Japanese order of battle and turned his army against the Japanese, fought with the Allies through 1945. But they lived off the land, I'm afraid.
Next question. Robert, on your stats, how many of the Indian Army troops in 14th Army were Gurkhas rather than Indian? And did you manage to access Indian Army records in India and Pakistan? I understand many of them are in the Lahore Museum.
Not in Pakistan, but yes, in India I did. And I had access, of course, I had access to the major Indian archives, which are all actually in London, in the British Library, the Indian Office archives. And I would have to come back to you about the Gurkhas, but the Gurkhas produced, I'm just at the top of my head, something like 40 odd battalions by 1945, but the Indian Army produced quantitatively many, many more. And I don't have the figures at the top of my head, but think about it like this. In 1942, there were more Gurkha battalions than Indian battalions, but that had changed by 1945. Proportionally, there were more Indian battalions than Gurkha battalions.
Another question. Cometh the hour, cometh the man. The Indian Army was lucky to have 3, Slim, Mountbatten, and Auchinleck,
yes,
and possibly 4th with the inclusion of Wingate. Mountbatten's reputation has taken a beating with criticism of his performance as viceroy and accounts of his open marriage. But your summary of his performance as wartime supremo is that he was exemplary, uniquely fitted for the job as it was then. Would you care to expand?
And I take that view because we need to understand what Mountbatten's job was. Mountbatten was the supreme Allied commander. He had to bring America, China, India, Britain, and everyone fighting in Southeast Asia Command together to serve a single purpose. Well, I can't think of many military diplomats as well equipped as Mountbatten to achieve those goals. Now, I'm not interested whatsoever in what he did as a viceroy or indeed his domestic arrangements, because they are largely irrelevant. It's very clear from everyone who observed and commented on Mountbatten, particularly those who were not British, that he was dramatically successful in his role. And most of the snide comments about the his SEAC command, the circus as some people called it, actually came from jealous Brits, but he was used to that because when he was chief of combined operations back in London, he had those sort of snide comments from the competitors in the Admiralty too. Now, I think if you were able to evaluate, if you want to evaluate achievement rather than rhetoric or anything else, SEAC, Southeast Asia Command, was a dramatically successful joint and combined operation led by a person who proved himself to be uniquely successful.
And our last comment is very appropriate one on which to end the night, which is, will a replay be available? There is so much wonderful material here. I'd love to rewatch. And the answer to that is yes. The video, or rather I should say the recording of tonight's lecture will be uploaded to YouTube, and a YouTube link will be sent out to everyone who is registered for the lecture. So all ticket holders will get the YouTube link in the usual way that I send them out, and the recording will be there as a private video. I think they call them for a fortnight before it's taken down, and it will in due course in about a year's time be uploaded publicly. But look, this has been a wonderful lecture. You've kept most of your audience right through question time, which is quite an achievement. Now, this really is a superb book. As I said, you're a gifted communicator. You write as well as you speak, if not better. And this is the distillation, I think you've said, of 30 years of writing, thinking, and researching the Burma campaign. And I thoroughly commend it to everyone. So go out and read. And thank you so much, everyone, for attending this lecture tonight. And most of all, thank you to Robert Lyman. Good night, everyone.
Thank you and good night.
Good night.